Hello guys, back again. I realized that I'm getting this up a little bit late. I'd hoped to have it posted on Monday, but it looks like it's going to be posted on Tuesday. My apologies. Yeah, this is all very weird and we're all just trying to do the best we can. So I'll extend the due date for this by a couple days so that you guys have plenty of time to watch the lectures and respond with questions and comments in the discussion thread. I just want to say, so far, I've been really impressed by your comments and questions. I've had a lot of fun answering them and engaging with them, so keep it up. We are so close to the end, so don't give up now. Let's see, other house cleaning sort of stuff. You do have a second paper due very soon. Hopefully you guys have made some progress on those. Please feel free to reach out, ask questions. That's what I'm here for. Even if we're not meeting face to face, I can still help you a bit with those papers. If your primary concerns are mainly editorial, right? If you're interested in making sure that the language is up to snuff, that your grammar and diction are good, I highly recommend that you take advantage of the Learning Commons, which is still operating their writing lab online. Okay. I know it's so weird not being on campus right now, but the college is really trying its best to keep its major programs up and running during this time. All right, so our next two lectures are going to be on Mussolini and fascism. So today what we'll do is a bit of the biographical stuff from his birth all the way up to his assumption of the role of prime minister in Italy. And then in the next lecture, what we'll do is we'll look over that specific manifesto of fascism and get a sense of what fascism actually means as a political ideology. It's a very, very tricky subject because one of the essential features of fascism is its distrust of ideology. So it's a moving target. All right. So I'm guessing some of you guys, when you think of fascism, what you mostly think of is German fascism. You think of the rise of Hitler and the genocidal regime that emerged in Germany prior to World War II. It's important to step back because that's not the sum total of fascism, either as an ideology or as a political practice. Right, fascism actually has its roots politically in Italy. Right, Mussolini forms the first fascist political party, but as an idea, right, as a general approach to the world, it really emerges out of the late 19th century backlash against democratization, against socialism, and against this sort of belief that the world was in chaos, right? So that's one of the reasons why we think of Carlyle as one of the progenitors of fascism. We'll talk a touch about other folks that we associate with the fascist worldview, or at least the ones that fascists take on themselves and adopt as their forefathers. All right. So Benito Mussolini was born in a town called Predapio in northern Italy, around the Po Valley. He was born in 1883, and that date should sound familiar to you because that's the year that Karl Marx died, right? So it's interesting just in terms of storytelling to see how socialism dies. Literally, the founder dies, and what emerges in the very same year is this man who is going to give birth to a fascist mindset. So interestingly, he was raised in a pretty liberal home. His father was a socialist blacksmith, union organizer, and striker. His mother was a Catholic school teacher who had a pretty liberal-minded view of Catholicism, informed in some ways by the ideas that are going to give birth to liberation theology. Benito Mussolini himself was actually named after another great world leader, right? I don't know if you guys know this, but he's named after a man named Benito Juarez. Benito Juarez was the president of Mexico and essentially stood firm in his nationalist liberal principles despite the onslaught of American interventionism and French interventionism. So he has an interesting namesake. It probably won't surprise you guys. Well, no, let's not do that. Let's just talk very quickly about what Italy looked like about the time of Mussolini's birth. Okay, so in our last lecture talking about Carlyle, we discussed this thing called the Risorgimento, right? And the Risorgimento is the rise of a unified Italy out of the mess of Austrian and French and what have you principalities of Italy. So we end up with a kingdom of Italy in 1861. And this is a very interesting agreement, all right? So generally speaking, the Risorgimento had actually been fought for by a group of folks we call Young Italy, right? Led by a man named Giuseppe Garibaldi. And Giuseppe Garibaldi and his guys were going into cities and taking over governments and running governments for the Italian people. But at the end of the day, as the end of the Risorgimento became clear, Garibaldi recognized that in the particular climate of international politics and the particular traditional orientation of the bulk of the Italian people, that this new unified Italy would not be able to be a republic, right? It would need a monarch. And he allied himself with a man named Victor Emmanuel II, who was a king, I think, of Savoy descent. Don't worry about that. He was the king of Sardinia. And he essentially shook hands with this guy, and they create the Kingdom of Italy. Now, the Kingdom of Italy is essentially going to last from 1861 through to the end of World War II, with some really interesting consequences for the rise of fascism in Italy. But we don't see the whole of the Italian peninsula fall under the reign of this king until 1870. So 1870 is the completion of the unification of the Kingdom of Italy. All right, so I'm going to pause real quick. Just 1 second. We are back. Sorry about that. So essentially, Italy is only 13 years old by the time Mussolini is born, right? This is a very young nation playing a game of continental politics with some really big movers and shakers, right? With the Empire of France, the Empire of the United Kingdom, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, the Empire of Germany, who has just recently unified itself, the Empire of the Ottomans and the Russians, right? So Italy is trying to grow and become a state in a pretty hostile environment, okay? By the time we get to the turn of the century, this state is functioning as a parliamentary monarchy with very, very limited suffrage. And what we're beginning to see is over the course of the previous 30 years, there's been a lot of industrialization. And most of that industrialization has been in the north of Italy. And so there in the north of Italy, we begin to see the emergence of, what do you think, guys? Proletariat, right? And with the rise of the proletariat, we see the rise of socialist ideology in the north. We see the rise of the Socialist Party and some pretty out there elements of socialist anarchism, syndicalist anarchists that begin to organize strikes, that begin to put pressure on the government to expand suffrage, that begin to put pressure on the government to reduce the role of the Catholic Church and the king in the functioning of politics, right, to create a more secular and parliamentary system in Italy. And this is very destabilizing in northern Italy. And a lot of folks, either because of their politics or because of their inability to work because of their politics, will flee Italy and come to this little country called the United States of America, right? And essentially from 1890 to 1910, 4 million Italians immigrate from Italy to the United States, many of them bringing with them that socialist and anarchist background. And in fact, the Galleanists, right, in an anarcho-socialist group here in the United States, would be the kind of premier terrorist organization of the early 20th century, leading the attack on Wall Street in 1920 that involved the bombing of the J.P. Morgan building and the death of 36 people and the injury of almost 300. So Italy is vital. Italy is changing. Italy is in the midst of the same sort of social upheaval that has been affecting Europe and the West, right, for essentially the previous century. Let's see. When we look at Mussolini's life, what we have to realize is that he is very influenced by the politics of the time. He's very influenced by his own father's politics. And by the age of 20, right, he is immersed in socialist politics in Italy. And in 1902, in order to escape the draft, right, to avoid military service, he flees to Switzerland. He's eventually convicted in absentia of desertion, and that's something that's going to haunt him in his years coming back to Italy. Now, Switzerland is a very open country during this time, especially in comparison to the empires around it. Political exiles from Italy, from Russia, from Germany were all finding their way to Switzerland during this time and forming very tight-knit organizations of international socialism. Now, while he's there, the two authors that Mussolini becomes most enamored of aren't Marx and Engels, actually, but are in fact Friedrich Nietzsche and George Sorel. And Nietzsche, some of you might know a little bit about him. It turns out that Mussolini's primary love in the work of Nietzsche has to do with Nietzsche's notion of the will to power, right? And essentially how it's through the will that the individual asserts himself and dominates his surroundings. There's a lot more going on in Nietzsche than that, but this is what appeals to a young Mussolini. As to George Sorel is really theoretically very important to the development of fascist ideology. George Sorel was a syndicalist, someone who believed in seizing the means of production and self-government at the level of industry, right? Except that during his lifetime, he became deeply disaffected with pacifism as a means of achieving these ends, and would in fact write a defense of violence. And over the course of his writing would basically come to defend violence as an end in itself, right? That simply the act of violence is an assertion of the will that is important to humanity and important to manhood in particular. And that it almost doesn't really matter why, as long as you are physically resisting the world's ability or desire to oppress you. All right. Mussolini loves this idea and is going to take this with him, and it's going to make it very difficult for him to function as a socialist, frankly. So Sorel really thought that liberalism and capitalism, the combination of these two things, produced a decadence, right? A passivity in mankind that essentially robbed us of our creative nature. All right. Yeah. Now, from 1903 to 1914, Mussolini's life is going to be in these socialist circles, right? He is going to be a socialist agitator and a journalist, a very important journalist. He's going to become the editor of one of the most important socialist magazines in Italy, and do an extraordinary job arguing that the working class needed to wrest power from the hands of the elite, right? He was not a reformist, all right? But this all begins to completely break down in 1914 with the beginning of World War I. So Italy, as you guys probably know, was allied with Germany and Austria at the beginning of World War I. And their alliance was a defensive alliance. And so because Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, right, because they were the aggressor, this didn't trigger that defensive alliance, right? A defensive alliance means I'll go to war if you have to defend yourself from someone. But because Austria-Hungary was the aggressor, this alliance isn't necessarily called into play. So there was a lot of disagreement in Italy over whether or not the country should intervene on the side of the Austrians and the Germans. And this is going to cause a massive fissure between Mussolini and the traditional left in Italy. And essentially what the socialist position is on World War I is that this is a war of empire, right? This is a war of bourgeois expansionism that these very rich industrialists, so that these kings and emperors want the working class to fight for them, right? And they are adamantly opposed to the working class shedding blood for the interest of the bourgeoisie and, you know, the remnants of the monarchy. Mussolini, on the other hand, having really taken this Sorel approach to heart, believes that engaging in this act of violence will be exactly what Italy needs to spark a revolution, right? We need the working class to get out there, guns in hand, blood, guts, ascetic suffering for the state in order to unleash their revolutionary potential. All right. This does not work out well. And in fact, when pressed on this, right, well, what the socialists are like, Mussolini, dude, like, what kind of revolution is this going to be, right? He says it doesn't matter. He says Italy needs a revolution. It will have a revolution, and it doesn't matter what the outcome of that revolution is. It just needs to be revitalized, okay? It tells you a lot about Mussolini, okay? And what essentially ends up happening is that on November 24th of 1914, after about a month of advocating on behalf of Italian entrance into the war, the Socialist Party of Italy, the PSI, kicks Mussolini out of their membership. Just a few days later, on December 5th, 1914, he writes a piece formally rejecting socialism, formally rejecting its goals, and insisting that there needs to be a new revolutionary party of Italy. So it's at the end of 1914 that he forms the first fascist party. They are the International Fascist Party of Italy. And he immediately advocates for Italy entering the war. He goes a step further in 1915 and actually enlists. He'll serve in the Italian military during World War I from 1915 to 1917, seeing about 9 months total of active duty. And during those times, both revealing himself to be rather brave in battle, but also using his connections within the military with his brothers in arms to organize his fascist party so that when the war is over, he is essentially going to be leaving with a chunk of the military indoctrinated into his ideology, which is fucking brilliant. But let's set that aside for a second. When he comes back in 1917, he's been formally kicked out of the Socialist Party. He's trying to figure out a way to make ends meet. And he finds a really fun way of paying his bills. He gets hired by MI5, right? And for those of you who don't know, MI5 is essentially the British version of the CIA. And he gets paid weekly to publish pro-war articles and to get together with his military buddies and go out and beat up anti-war protesters and to break strikes, Okay, so his leadership of this particular group, right, under the auspices of fucking English foreign intervention into Italy, ends up becoming the basis for the Black Shirts, right? And the Black Shirts are essentially a fascist paramilitary organization who are going to help catapult Mussolini into power and ensure his power through violence during the entirety of his reign. Thanks, England. Thanks for that. It's what we call blowback. All right. Now, what I do want to mention here before getting into the ins and outs of fascism, which I'm going to do in the next lecture, is to explain a little bit about his rise to power. So from 1917 to 1919, he's got his little street gang of ruffians that are strike breaking and beating up protesters. By 1919, these are officially a paramilitary. Right. In 1919, we're looking at a membership of approximately 60,000 members stationed throughout Italy, whose jobs are essentially to harass, terrorize, and violently oppress socialists, liberals, reformers, and strikers. Right. And it's through their anti-strike violence that the corporate, right, the industrial powers of Italy come to support Mussolini, right? Because there's nothing that a CEO likes more than someone who will show up and bloody the noses of union organizers. And this is where he develops this corporate base that's going to support his bid for power. In 1921, he runs for office, the Chamber of Deputies. It's essentially the lower house of the Italian parliament, and he's elected. And less than a year later, he takes over the government. And he does this on October 27th of 1922 with what's known as the March on Rome. Very, very briefly, the intervening years since the end of World War I and 1922 have been rough years for Italy. Italy has been seriously impacted by the Spanish flu. It's been impacted by the global recession that follows the war. And to top it all off, Italy entered the war on the side of the British and the French and the Americans. And at the end of the day, when all of the peace treaties are signed, Italy has gained virtually nothing in terms of territory. And a lot of people who advocated for the entrance into the war on the basis of nationalist sentiment feel like Italy has been slighted and feel like the liberal government in power is responsible for Italy not being taken seriously on the world stage. And so on October 27th, what Mussolini does is he marches on Rome with 30,000 of his Black Shirts. At the same time that they are marching on Rome, the other 30,000 are in small cities and villages throughout Italy, invading and taking over governments and bureaucracies, right? The then liberal prime minister of Italy, a man named, oh my God, I know this. I should have written it down. Luigi Facta asks to be able to call martial law to deal with this massive Italian-wide uprising. And Victor Emmanuel III, right, the now king of Italy, refuses to allow him to call a state of emergency and actually hands over the prime ministership to Mussolini, all right, on the grounds that he's going to be better for business and that he's a more sound advocate for order and that he is more deferential to the Catholic Church, right? And essentially the traditional right in Italy, the monarchists, the backers of Catholicism, the backers of business, are like, this is the guy we need. This is the guy who is going to catapult Italy into modernity. And they back his coup. Mussolini will essentially run as dictator Italy from 1922 to 1945. In 1929, he's going to grab more power, make himself the absolute dictator of Italy, and will do so with the backing of Catholics and the industrial community, and set about pretty dramatically um, altering the course of history. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you there with the rise of Mussolini. Next time I videotape, I will be talking to you a little bit about how the idea of fascism changes over time, why it changes over time, what it means today, and we'll talk a little bit about Mussolini's downfall. All right. Thank you guys for listening. I know we covered a lot of material today. I'll talk to you later.